Many people find history to be boring because it was presented to them as a series of names and dates and events that had to be memorized and crammed into their heads and then regurgitated onto a piece of paper in the form of a test or a quiz, only to be promptly forgotten as soon as the answer was marked down on the sheet. I love history, though, because it's first and foremost a story. It's the incredible adventure story of people just like us who have lived and loved, laughed and fought and struggled and died on this planet. It shows us how we got to where we are today. And foremost, as a believer in Jesus Christ as our Messiah and Savior, we see history as God's story. The story of his creation, interaction, and redemption of mankind in the world. My philosophy of teaching history is to ignite the imagination of my students to these fascinating stories. There is one such fascinating story in the history of the American War for Independence that is not very well known. Although it has received renewed attention recently due to the book entitled Washington's Spies, The Story of America's First Spy Ring by Alexander Rose, and the Netflix series that was based upon the book called Turn, Washington's Spies. This specific story contained in that book, in that series, that I am referring to is the story of the capture, trial, and subsequent execution of British Major John Andre. Now, most people have heard of Benedict Arnold, the American general who made a deal with the British to surrender West Point to them. John Andre was the British contact with whom Arnold was dealing. If I was teaching American History 221, and by the grace of God someday I will, one of the stories that I would tell my students would be that of Major John Andre. I would then use that story as a way to get my students to interact with a number of primary sources. Two of those primary sources are found in America's historical Imprints database. To give the students experience searching through the database, I'd give them the title and the author of these works and then let them find the original sources. The two sources are these. First, the trial of Major John Andre, which is the official record of the military trial convicting Andre as a spy, along with copies of letters written by Major Andre, George Washington, Benedict Arnold, and the British commander Sir Henry Clinton. These were entered into evidence at the trial. The second is an authentic narrative of the causes which led to the death of Major John Andre. It was written by Joshua Hett Smith. Smith was asked by Benedict Arnold to allow him to meet with Andre at his house and then to escort Andre back to British lines. Now, Smith insisted that he was a loyal American and that he was lied to by Arnold and used by Arnold. Now, Smith ended up being tried as a spy, but he was acquitted. But by that time, his reputation had been destroyed. Essay questions that I would then ask the class to respond to would help them compare, contrast, and analyze these documents. Some of these questions would be, why did Joshua Hett Smith write his account of what happened? Why did John Andre plead his case in the way that he did? Compare and contrast the tales told by these two documents. Where do they agree? Where do they disagree? Is one perhaps more of an accurate account of what really happened? Why or why not? Given the arguments and appeals made by Arnold, Clinton, and Andre, why did George Washington go ahead and hang Andre as a spy? What would you have done, and why? The intended outcome of this exercise would be that the student would further develop their skills in accessing and interacting with primary sources, and that they would learn to apply, evaluate, and analyze those sources.